Well, thanks for inviting me to give a presentation at the NEO conference. I'm very excited to share with you what I'll be talking about today on public-private partnerships in the low-carbon transition. For a bit of background on myself, my name is Casady. I have a doctorate in civil and environmental engineering from Stanford University, and the crux of my research is on public-private partnership governance and sort of in the institutional development that surrounds public-private partnership markets. And so today I'm going to be sharing, what sort of role public-private partnerships might play in facilitating the climate agenda and then all things sustainability. And so I'll start unpacking some of those institutional considerations as we go forward. So I'm going to share my screen now. So like I said, I'm going to be talking a bit about the role that public-private partnerships and specifically private investment in infrastructure might play in helping combat the climate crisis. But one of the first things we need to understand is sort of what does the investment landscape look like? And for that, we can look to the Global Infrastructure Hub. So they recently did an analysis of investment trends and how things have been going in the when it comes to private investment in infrastructure. One of the interesting things that they found was that actually within the last decade, between 2010 and 2019, that private investment in infrastructure has been declining. And so we've seen that go down over the last decade or so. And other interesting things to note about that is that largely this has been a result of countries in Europe and other mature democracies turning away from private investment in infrastructure. And we've also seen significant decreases in investment in social infrastructure as well. But there's some also counter trends going on at the same time. We're also seeing that in places like Latin America, Middle East, and North Africa, these are actually very fast growing regions. So while other parts of the world are maybe looking for publicly financed options to delivering their infrastructure, in terms of the development of agenda, a lot of emerging markets are starting to experiment with the process of incorporating private investment in infrastructure. So there's some interesting trends going on here. And what's also interesting is we have to also factor in considerations for how COVID and the pandemic has disrupted this ongoing trend. What we've seen is, from 2020 into 2021, that countries have started to look at different ways that they're going to go about stimulating their economies and try and also sort of meet this moment and address the climate crisis. As I'm giving this presentation now, we have lots of world leaders and others meeting in Glasgow talking about the climate crisis and how to address this issue at a global scale for COP26. So the key question is, and what appears to be the case is that infrastructure is going to play a critical role in actually delivering these objectives at a global scale. And what we see in some of this data is that for the G20 countries alone, that they've announced already roughly about $3.2 trillion in infrastructure stimulus that is planned to kind of meet this moment. So that for those countries in perspective, that's about 3.2% of their GDP. This is a significant commitment. At the same time, it's important to note that 30% of this is actually going to be focused on the low carbon transition. So a lot of this investment is going to be targeted at and oriented around climate goals. And so whether it's in transport, social infrastructure, water, renewable energy generation, there's going to be a climate focus to this. But looking, in terms of these new commitments to infrastructure and contrasting them with what we've seen in terms of declining private investment in infrastructure in the past decade, the question becomes if private investment is going to play a significant role in the low carbon transition going forward, how are countries going to approach that? And one of the vehicles that has been the main tool for delivering private investment in infrastructure is public-private partnerships. And so as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of emerging markets and developing economies who are very actively pursuing the private investment model. But the key questions that I'm going to raise in the next few slides center around what sort of institutional environment is required in order to enable those investments to actually take place. Because that's part of the key consideration here. There's a lot of additional pieces that need to be in play to facilitate these types of investments rather than just the projects themselves. So what might some of those institutional components look like? Well, naturally, public-private partnerships, based on the research that I've done, we've shown that they really require an enabling institutional field. And so these are some of the key institutional conditions or factors that we've identified that really play a role in facilitating these types of projects and the use of private investment in infrastructure. So at the top, we might naturally expect the regulatory regime to play a key role. And so that has to do with all the regulatory and frameworks that governments put in place to establish procurement processes, and how contract management is going to take place, how the project development process will be carried out, and how the overall execution of these public-private partnerships will take place. At the same time, stakeholders are also interested in the transparency of that process. So the openness around that procurement, the bid documents, contractual changes, and possible renegotiations, and ultimately how those projects are being evaluated and whether they can actually deliver significant value for money relative to other forms of infrastructure delivery. Moving on to the third condition, naturally there's a component of this that public-private partnerships need to be championed and also need to have sort of local support. So without sort of political buy-in or support from the public, in private investment infrastructure is going to struggle to make inroads in certain markets without some of that underlying normative support. And in the same vein, when it comes to the market itself, there's also going to be some sort of conduciveness from the political and business environment surrounding PPP project development and implementation. And so that gets to the core of this market reliability. So what are sort of the underlying functions of the market that are in place to actually facilitate the delivery of public-private partnership projects? So that may be things like the access to financing, the involvement of institutional investors, critical components that actually bring the capital to bear to deliver these types of projects. Specifically, if we're going to start delivering projects at the scale that is being promised to kind of meet the low carbon transition. And finally, for these last two conditions, naturally, institutional support and governance are key questions. So it's one thing to have sort of a surrounding market environment that's conducive for these types of projects. It's another thing to have laws and regulations put in place to manage these types of projects. But it's something else to have the actual institutional capacity within the government to manage procurements, to deal with contract management, to have the people with the appropriate skills in place to actually sort of execute on the legislation and understand the market that's at play. So there's an institutional component within the government as well that's key to actually delivering these projects as well. And naturally, what comes of this is different degrees of governance mechanisms that need to be put in place to deal with things like expropriations or renegotiations or arbitration and other sorts of conciliation mechanisms that come about when things don't go as planned. So taking these all together, what's important to note from this is that at its core, these institutional conditions can be viewed in a cohesive sort of framework indicative of sort of mature PPP markets. And what we found in some of our research is that at the crux of all these intersections of these institutional conditions are sort of three underlying principles that we think will be really important for governments going forward if they want to pursue private investment in infrastructure through public-private partnerships as part of their climate agenda. And that starts with things like establishing legitimacy. So what we mean by establishing legitimacy is putting in place a foundation of rules and procedures that are acceptable in that jurisdiction. So establishing processes that everyone is comfortable with, and they are fair and open, and in a way give credibility to the process of project development, project delivery, and project management in these cases. So that's what we mean by legitimacy. It's establishing the rules of the game, so to speak. At the same time, there's also the need to establish, trust as well, and build trust in this process. So that stems a lot from things like, that political and social will, that championing of the delivery process. And, without, it's one thing to establish legitimate rules and processes, but if people don't trust the delivery model of public-private partnerships and the potential good that private investment in infrastructure could yield in helping achieve good societal outcomes for the environment, then that's a core tenet that needs to be in play. Otherwise, other elements will fail. And then thirdly, as I emphasized previously, in addition to establishing legitimacy and developing trust, critical to those two things as well is the need to build capacity within the government to carry out the execution and management of public-private partnership projects. It's one thing to establish the rules of the game. It's another thing for people to be open and willing to engage in these partnerships in a trusting way, and be comfortable with this vulnerability that comes with relying on other parties to meet these objectives. But it's something else entirely to actually have the skills and knowledge to go out and execute these projects. So I think my key takeaway for the role that public-private partnerships will play in a low-carbon transition is this, and that is that if this is going to be a critical tool to meeting this moment and dealing with the climate crisis, these core tenets need to be established at an institutional level in order for these projects to flourish. So thanks. That's my presentation.